I was 27 years old when I realized my parents had never told me the truth about our family. Not part of the truth. Not a softened version. Not a painful story they struggled to explain. The actual truth. What they gave me instead was a family history polished into something easier to live with. And for most of my life, I accepted it. I accepted the silences. I accepted the missing details. I accepted the way certain conversations stopped the moment I entered the room. I thought that was just how some families were. But one afternoon, a single document changed everything. It did not reveal a minor lie. It revealed that the people who raised me had built our family on a version of the past that was never real. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee any of it. Stories like this often surface on exposed stories media, where one hidden truth can change the meaning of an entire life. But when the story belongs to your own family, the shock feels different. It is not only about betrayal. It is about identity. It is about realizing the people who taught you who you were had quietly edited the answer. My parents were the kind of people others respected. My father was disciplined, steady, and deeply concerned with appearances. He believed in keeping the house clean, bills paid, and personal matters private. He was not cold exactly, but warmth from him came in controlled doses. You earned affection by not creating trouble. My mother was softer. She had a quiet way of making pain look manageable. She remembered birthdays, packed lunches, sat through school concerts, and always seemed to know when someone needed tea, silence, or a blanket. If my father ran the structure of our family, my mother preserved its emotional atmosphere. Together, they looked stable. I was their only child. Or at least, that was what I had been told. Growing up, I never questioned that part of the story. There were no obvious signs that anything about my place in the family was unusual. We lived in the same town for most of my childhood. We had routines, traditions, and the kind of repetitive family language that makes children feel anchored. Summer cookouts, holiday photographs, church twice a month. From the outside, nothing about us seemed incomplete. If anything, my parents gave the impression of people who had simplified life on purpose. They did not talk much about their younger years. My father usually summarized his past in efficient fragments. He had worked hard, made sacrifices, and built a decent life. My mother spoke more, but only about harmless things. School, music, recipes her grandmother taught her, a few stories about growing up poor. Whenever I asked how they met, I got the same clean version. They met in their 20s. My father had just begun establishing himself professionally. My mother was working at a dental office. They fell in love, married a year later, and had me after a long wait and many prayers. That phrase appeared often in our family. A long wait and many prayers. My mother said it with a bittersweet smile whenever someone commented that I was such a wanted child. At the time, it felt tender. Later, I realized it was also a shield. The first crack in that story appeared when I was 13. I found an old family Bible in the attic while helping my mother sort Christmas decorations. Inside the front cover were handwritten births, marriages, and deaths spanning several generations. Most of it made no impression on me until I noticed one name I didn't recognize. A girl's name, written between my parents' marriage date and my birth. No explanation, no note, just a name and a date from 3 years before I was born. I asked my mother who it was. She looked at the page for a second too long before answering. Then she said it was probably a cousin my grandmother had written in by mistake. She shut the book gently and asked me to bring down another box. The answer sounded plausible, but not convincing. That was the first time I remember feeling that my mother's voice could become careful in a way that meant more than ordinary privacy. Still, I was 13. Life moved on, and family discomfort is easy for children to misfile as nothing. The second crack came in college. I went home for Thanksgiving in the year 2018. During dinner, one of my father's older cousins, who had been drinking more than usual, started telling stories about how different things almost turned out. No one reacted at first. Then he looked at me and said something I still hear clearly. He said, "You were never supposed to be an only child." The whole table froze. My mother put down her fork. My father spoke before anyone else could. He said the cousin was confused and changed the subject so sharply it felt like a slap disguised as politeness. No one mentioned it again that night. But I thought about it for weeks afterward. Not because the sentence was clear, because of how quickly my parents killed it. I called my mother later and asked what he meant. She sounded tired. She said families say strange things when they've had too much to drink. Then she added that some old wounds were not worth reopening. That answer only made the discomfort worse. Old wounds. Plural. Again, it was not proof, but it was enough to make me look backward at things I had ignored. The unexplained name in the Bible. The way my parents never displayed baby pictures older than a certain date. The strange tenderness my mother sometimes had around children with dark hair and wide-set eyes, traits I did not share. Then there was the cemetery. For years, my mother visited a cemetery every spring by herself. She said she was visiting her mother's grave. That was partly true because my grandmother was buried there. But once, when I was 16 and insisted on going with her, she parked in a different section first. She stood in front of a small headstone for several minutes without speaking. There were flowers already there, a toy windmill, and a date that made no sense to me at the time. When I asked who it was, she said only, "Someone we lost." I thought she meant an extended relative. Now I know she was being honest and dishonest at the same time. That is one of the cruelest things about family lies. They often contain fragments of truth just large enough to make the liar feel less guilty and the listener more confused. You are not exactly deceived. You were prevented from understanding. The actual revelation came because my father had a minor surgery. Nothing life-threatening. A routine abdominal procedure with a recovery long enough that he needed help organizing paperwork at home. I took 3 days off work and stayed with my parents to drive him to follow-up appointments and keep my mother from exhausting herself. On the second day, my mother asked me to sort insurance files in the hallway cabinet. Most of it was boring. Old statements, prescription records, home warranty documents. Then I found a sealed envelope tucked behind a file box. It was labeled with my mother's name in my father's handwriting. The words below it made my stomach tighten. "Do not destroy." I should have left it alone. I know that. Even now, I know that. But secrecy has a smell once you've noticed it often enough. And that envelope smelled like every half-answer I had been given for years. Inside were hospital records. Some were old enough that the paper had begun to yellow. The name at the top was my mother's. The date was 3 years before I was born. And under delivery outcome, there were 2 words I could not process at first. Live birth. I read the page twice. Then 3 times. The room went so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I kept turning pages, hoping I had misunderstood the context. But the documents only made it clearer. My mother had given birth before I was born. Not a miscarriage. Not a stillbirth. A live birth. Attached to the records was another page. An intake form from a private adoption agency. That was the moment the truth stopped being abstract. There had been another child. A real child. Born to my mother. And my parents had hidden that from me my entire life. I remember walking into the kitchen holding the papers. My mother looked up first. Her face changed immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. She knew exactly what I had found. My father was sitting at the table in one of those rigid post-surgery positions that made him look older than I had ever seen him. When he saw the documents in my hand, he closed his eyes for 1 second, as if some part of him had expected this day for years. I asked the simplest question possible. "Who is this?" No one answered. My mother started crying before she spoke. That told me everything I needed to know about the size of the lie. People do not cry like that over paperwork alone. They cry like that when the past has finally arrived and refuses to stay buried. Then she said the sentence that split my life in half. She said, "You had a sister." Not half. Had. That grammar felt like another wound layered on top of the first. I asked where she was. I asked why no one had ever told me. I asked whether she died. My father said my name in that slow, controlled voice he used when he wanted me to stop moving emotionally and start listening. I hated him for it instantly. My mother answered before he could. She said my sister was born when she was very young, before she married my father, before the life they later built together. She said there had been pressure, shame, and circumstances she did not know how to explain in one breath. Then she said something even worse. My sister was alive. Alive. Not lost in the past. Not a sealed tragedy. Not a gravestone in a cemetery. Alive somewhere in the world while I grew up believing I was the only child my parents had ever loved. That was the end of the first version of my family. The second version began the moment I realized the truth had not only been hidden from me, it had been managed. Once the word alive entered the room, nothing else mattered. Not the surgery, not the careful stacks of paperwork, not the years of ordinary family routine that had filled the house with a false sense of completeness. The only thing that mattered was the question I asked next. Where is she now? My mother covered her face with one hand. She looked ashamed in a way that was difficult to watch because it wasn't defensive. It was older than that. Like shame she had worn so long it had become part of her physical posture. My father, on the other hand, straightened almost automatically. That was when I realized the secret had survived this long because my parents were not carrying the same burden. My mother carried grief. My father carried control. He told me to sit down. I refused. There are moments when sitting feels too much like agreeing to the pace of someone else's version of the truth. I had been living at their pace my entire life without knowing it. I wasn't about to start again now. So I stood there holding the papers while my mother tried to explain. She was 19 when she got pregnant. The father was someone she loved deeply but never married. He died in a car accident before the baby was born. After that, my mother's family panicked. They were religious, proud, and terrified of scandal. An unmarried daughter, pregnant and grieving, was not something they knew how to face honestly. So they turned the situation into something they could manage privately. My mother was sent away to stay with an aunt in another county until the birth. She said the arrangement was presented as temporary. That phrase came up more than once, and I noticed it because it sounded like the kind of language adults use when they are already lying but want to leave room for their own conscience. Everything temporary. Everything for now. Everything until things calm down. The baby was born healthy. My mother held her, named her, counted her fingers. Then her own mother began pressuring her to sign papers. She said there was no future for an unmarried girl with a child. She said adoption was the only chance either of them had. I wanted to interrupt. I wanted to ask 100 questions all at once. But my mother was speaking with the kind of trembling urgency that comes when a person has been carrying a story too long and no longer has the energy to shape it nicely. So I let her continue. She signed the papers. Then she regretted it almost immediately. She said she begged her mother to help reverse the process, but by then everything had already been handled. That was the word she used, and I hated it. Handled. As if a baby were paperwork. For years after that, she knew almost nothing. only that the adoptive family lived in another state and had agreed to a closed arrangement. Then she met my father. I turned to look at him then because his role in the lie mattered as much as the original loss. He told me he knew before they married. My mother had told him because she said she could not start a life with someone while hiding that kind of pain. At first, he said he accepted it compassionately. He told her the past did not define her and that they would build a future together. That version of him might even have been real once. But later, when I asked why he helped keep the truth from me, his answer revealed who he became. He said he believed the family they built needed a clear beginning. He said old trauma had a way of poisoning present stability. He said he did not want me growing up confused about what counted as family. That sentence changed how I saw him forever. What counted as family? As if my sister's existence had been a technical issue. As if biology, grief, and a mother's first child could be administratively edited out so a cleaner story could thrive. He had not only helped bury the truth, he had built philosophy around the burial. I asked whether my sister knew my mother wanted her. My mother nodded and said, later. That word mattered. Later meant contact. Later meant this was not just a sealed wound from decades earlier. Later meant there was more. I asked her what later meant. She said my sister found her 15 years after the adoption. Not through magic, through records, persistence, and whatever instincts children carry when part of their history has been denied to them. She wrote my mother a letter. I asked where the letter was. My mother said she had burned it after reading it the first time because she was terrified my father would find it before she figured out what to do. Then she admitted something else. She had written back. That was the second shock layered on top of the first. My mother had a living daughter. And not only that, she had contact with her. Not once, not briefly, for years. My father had known about that too. He closed his eyes when I looked at him. Then he said yes. My mother and my sister had been exchanging letters on and off for nearly a decade before eventually meeting in person. That first meeting happened when I was 14. At the exact age when I found the family Bible and asked about the strange name. That coincidence hit me hard enough to make me sit down at last. There I had been, a child sensing something hidden and being gently redirected. Meanwhile, my mother had already held her daughter again after years apart. My father had known, and together they came home and kept living as if I were the only child in the house and in the family story. I asked if I had ever almost met her. My mother answered with immediate pain. She said yes, twice. Once at a church fair in another town where she had hoped to introduce us from a distance and then lost the nerve. Once at a park where my father insisted the situation was becoming too dangerous emotionally and made her leave before my sister arrived. Hearing that made me feel a grief I had no name for. I had not simply been denied information. I had been kept from a person. A sister with a face, a voice, a history, and a place in my life that was repeatedly withheld because my parents could not decide whether truth was worth the disruption it would bring. I asked her name. My mother said it carefully. Rachel. The name did not feel foreign. That was the strange part. It felt like one of those words you have heard around corners for years without ever consciously registering it. Then my mother stood up and went to the bedroom. She came back holding a small wooden box. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, and copies of letters tied together with ribbon. The oldest photo showed a woman in her 30s standing beside a lake, smiling cautiously into the camera. My mother touched the edge of the picture and said, "That's your sister." Rachel looked nothing like I expected and exactly like us. She had my mother's mouth, my father's eyes, though he had no biological connection to her, only the strange imprint that shared household mannerisms can leave on imagination. Mostly, though, she looked like herself. A whole person with years I had not been allowed to know. My mother said Rachel was kind, careful, funny, guarded. She worked in public education and had 2 children. She knew about me. She had always wanted to meet me. I turned to my father again and asked why he kept stopping that from happening. He answered with more honesty than I expected. He said he was afraid, not of Rachel herself, of what the truth would do once it entered the family openly. He said every year that passed made the revelation harder, and eventually he convinced himself that preserving peace was more merciful than detonating it. Peace. That word sounded obscene in that room. A peace built on absence is not peace. It is managed silence. I understood that completely now. The confrontation did not explode the way people imagine family confrontations do. No one threw anything. No one stormed out dramatically. Instead, the room filled with a quieter devastation. My mother crying because the secret was finally visible. My father speaking less because every explanation made him look smaller. And me realizing that every major family memory I had was now divided into 2 versions. The one I lived. The one they edited. That evening, I went home with the box. Not because I asked permission. Because my mother placed it in my hands and said, "You deserve to know her story too." I stayed up until nearly 4 in the morning reading letters. Rachel's handwriting changed over the years. At first formal, almost careful not to demand too much. Later warmer, then more wounded, then warm again in a different, wiser way. She never wrote like someone trying to steal a family. She wrote like someone trying to stand near the truth without frightening it away. That was what undid me. All those years, my father framed the secret as something dangerous, but the letters were filled with the exact opposite of danger. Restraint, patience, dignity, the repeated willingness to accept crumbs of connection rather than demand justice for what had been taken from her. By morning, I had made my decision. I was going to meet my sister, with or without my parents' blessing. I called Rachel the next afternoon. My hands shook while the phone rang. I had read enough of her letters by then to hear her personality in the silence before she answered. When she finally said hello, I recognized nothing and something at the same time. That, I would later learn, is what family can feel like when truth arrives late. I introduced myself badly. Too fast. Too formal. I said my name and then, as if she might need help placing it, added, "I'm your brother." She didn't speak for several seconds. Then she laughed once and started crying. Not because the moment was sentimental in a clean way. Because it was overdue. We spoke for almost 2 hours that first day. Most of it was awkward. Not unpleasant. Just honest in a way that left no room for performance. We were not children meeting inside a fantasy of reunion. We were adults comparing the edges of 2 lives built around the same absence. Rachel told me she grew up with good parents. Not perfect parents, but loving ones. She had not been abused. She had not been hidden. That mattered. At the same time, she said something had always felt unfinished. Her adoptive parents told her she had been wanted and chosen, which was true. But she sensed early that the story of her beginning had been softened too much. She said children can feel narrative gaps before they know how to name them. She found my mother through records, persistence, and one old church contact who recognized a maiden name. The first time she wrote, she expected nothing. She said she had imagined my mother might not respond, or worse, might deny everything and ask never to be contacted again. Instead, my mother wrote back with pages of grief. That was the beginning of their secret second relationship. I asked Rachel whether she was angry at me. Not rationally, I knew she shouldn't be. But family secrets do not produce rational emotional landscapes. Sometimes proximity to the lie creates unintended blame. She said no. She said I was the only one who never chose anything in the story. A child raised inside an edited version of reality could not be blamed for believing what he was given. Then she said something that hit me harder than almost anything else had. She said she had looked at my school pictures once. My whole body went cold. She explained that years earlier, my mother had mailed her a copy of a family Christmas card by mistake, forgetting my father would notice it missing from the stack if she kept it separate. Rachel had kept that card for years. She said she used to stare at my face and wonder whether we would have liked each other if life had been different. That sentence ruined me in the quietest possible way. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. Only siblings think like that. We met in person the following weekend, not at my parents' house. Neither of us wanted the architecture of their life framing the first moment we shared. We met at a botanical garden halfway between our cities. Rachel got there before I did. She was sitting on a bench near a fountain with her hands folded too neatly in her lap. When she stood up, the resemblance felt physically disorienting. Not because she looked exactly like me. She didn't. Because pieces of my mother, my own expressions, and someone entirely separate from all of us were standing in one body at once. We hugged awkwardly. Then we laughed because awkwardness was more honest than pretending to immediate intimacy. The first hour was full of cautious questions. Work, children, favorite music, who snores in the family, harmless things made sacred by how long they were withheld. Later, under a row of trees that had started turning yellow for autumn, she asked the question I knew would come. She asked whether I hated our parents. I thought about it before answering. I did not hate my mother. Not even then. What I felt toward her was more complicated and, in some ways, sadder. I understood how shame and coercion had trapped her young, then taught her to keep choosing delay over disruption. My father was harder. What I felt toward him was anger sharpened by clarity. He did not create the original wound, but he institutionalized it inside our family. He had decades in which he could have chosen truth and instead chose control, management, timing, and silence. Rachel nodded when I said that. Then she told me she had never hated my mother either. She had been hurt by her, yes. There were years when every delayed answer felt like another abandonment. But hatred requires certainty, and my mother had never felt like a villain to her. Only like someone too frightened to be fully brave. That insight changed something in me. Over the next months, the aftermath unfolded in layers. My mother wanted us all to become a real family immediately. That was impossible. You cannot turn revelation into intimacy by force. Rachel was wise enough to resist that pressure. She said she wanted truth, not performance. No staged holiday photos for social media. No family speeches pretending the lost years had made everyone stronger. No sentimental language that erased the damage. My father struggled most with the new arrangement. Rachel agreed to meet him only once at first. That meeting happened in a quiet diner off the highway because she said if he was going to explain himself, she wanted fluorescent lights and no emotional atmosphere to help him. I admired her for that. He apologized. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but more directly than I had ever heard him speak about anything painful. He said he believed he was protecting the family. He said every year made confession harder. He said eventually the lie became part of the structure of his own identity as husband and father. Rachel listened. Then she said the one sentence that seemed to pierce him cleanly. She said, "You protected the version of the family that made you most comfortable." There was no answer to that. Some relatives learned the truth later and reacted exactly as families often do. A few were horrified. Some asked why the past needed to be dragged up now. Others said my parents had done their best under difficult circumstances. I stopped respecting the phrase "did their best" for a while after that. Sometimes people do their best. Sometimes they do what protects them most and then call it their best because the alternative is morally unbearable. I learned to hear the difference. Exposed stories media often shows how one secret can alter the emotional meaning of an entire family. This was one of those stories. Not because my family suddenly became monstrous. Because the truth revealed how much ordinary love can coexist with deep, sustained deception. That is what makes family secrets so difficult to confront. The people hiding them are not always villains in the simple sense. They may still pack your lunch, pay your tuition, remember your birthday, and sit with you through heartbreak. But if they control your reality by withholding fundamental truth, love alone does not erase the harm. My relationship with my mother survived. Different, but real. She stopped speaking in polished summaries after that. She told me the hard stories too. The shame, the pressure, the years of praying Rachel would forgive her before she was even brave enough to ask for that forgiveness aloud. With my father, survival took another shape. We still speak, but I no longer accept his preference for silence as wisdom. I ask direct questions now. I wait for complete answers. If they do not come, I stop pretending the omission is harmless. Rachel became part of my life slowly, not as a missing puzzle piece that made everything beautiful once inserted. That is not how it works. She became part of my life as another adult with her own history, wounds, humor, habits, and boundaries. That made the relationship more honest and ultimately more durable. The first time she came to my house for dinner, my wife noticed something before I did. She said the way Rachel laughed sounded like my mother before grief made her quieter. That sentence stayed with me because it captured what I had been feeling without language. Family resemblance is not only in faces. Sometimes it lives in interrupted possibilities. If there is one lesson inside this story, it is not simply that my parents never told me the truth about our family. It is that secrecy does not preserve love. It distorts it. It forces everyone to adapt around an absence they cannot name, and then calls that adaptation peace. Truth, even late, is painful. But the pain of truth and the pain of decades of distortion are not the same. Only one of them gives people the chance to build something real afterward. The other just teaches them how to live inside false stability. My sister should have been in my childhood photos. She should have been at graduations, holidays, and the cheap summer trips our family used to take. She should have been there when I learned to drive, when I left for college, when our mother cried at my wedding. None of that can be recovered. But truth did give us something back. Not lost time. Something smaller and, in a way, more important. The right to stop living according to a lie someone else found easier to maintain. That is why this story matters. Not because it is shocking, because it reveals the cost of silence when silence is used to manage other people's identities. And because families everywhere do this more often than they admit. If this story stayed with you, that may be why exposed stories media continues to matter. Not only because hidden truths create dramatic stories, because they reveal what happens when people confuse protection with control and peace with absence. Sometimes the family you think you know is only the version your parents found easiest to explain. And if there is some unanswered question in your own family history, some missing name, some story that changes shape every time it is told, pay attention. Ask again. Read the paper in the drawer. Open the envelope labeled "Do Not Destroy." Because sometimes the truth about your family is not lost. It is waiting for the moment someone finally becomes strong enough to bear it.